All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session of our Forage Forum Friday here on Friday, January 14th, 2022. So we're appreciative that you all are with us today. We're excited about our topic with Dr. Shelby Gruss talking about sorghum genetics. So if you have any questions throughout this presentation, feel free to put them in the chat box. Or at the end, you are free to unmute and ask your questions then. At the end, we will also have a poll that will pop up, so we would greatly appreciate if you could complete that for us. And with that, without further ado, Shelby Gruss is a doctor with Purdue University. She's a postdoctoral research student there, and she's done some amazing work looking at sorghum genetics, looking at creating some Durin-free sorghum, among other things. So we're excited to have Dr. Shelby Gruss with us today, and I will let you take it away from there, Shelby.
Thank you for the introduction. I'll get sharing my screen. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Hi, I'm Dr. Shelby Gruss, as Alyssa had mentioned. I'm a postdoc student here at Purdue University, and my PhD had focused on sorghum. And so today I'm going to kind of be talking about the variety of sorghum you can find, different types, and then also towards the end, I'm going to talk more about some of the research that was completed here at Purdue. And so with that, as I said, I'm going to be talking about opportunities with sorghum genetics. And one thing I'd like to point out is I really like this photo. It's what this is a forage test plot that we have here at Purdue University. And I think it just shows right here how much variation sorghum can have within itself. And I mean, we have some sorghum Sudan grass that's medium height here, forage sorghums that are growing to be extremely tall, and some shorter sorghum varieties up front. And so the topics that I'm going to be covering today are variation in sorghum, so talking about those different sorghum species or sorghum that we have available today, different ways that sorghum can be utilized, how sorghum can potentially fit into your operation. I'm not here trying to sway you to plant all your acreage in sorghum, but there are definitely spots where sorghum could play a really important role. Also, some concerns that come along when you do use sorghum, traits that I think need to be considered when you are planning on planting sorghum, and then some future opportunities, and that kind of goes back to that work that I've been doing at Purdue. And so why sorghum? Why do we care about sorghum? Sorghum is a really important crop. It's the third most produced cereal throughout the US, and there's been over 2.47 million hectares of it planted. Why it's so important is, well, it thrives really, really well in semi-arid to arid environments. It's naturally drought tolerant, so it's really good in opportunities where if you're in a drought prone area or you have, say, some land that's not as high quality, it also performs well in low nitrogen environments. So it can really thrive in these areas where potentially corn or other summer annuals may not do so well. It can produce a large amount of biomass. Like I said, it has a ton of variation. You can see from the green sorghum that's out front to the forage sorghum in the back, there can be a large amount of biomass produced here. So it can be able to feed a lot of your animals throughout the year. It can be used during that time of summer slump when, say, your cool seasons are decreasing in growth. Sorghum will take off. It loves that high heat. It really does well in those environments and can be very nutritional. Its use as a forage is really important. It can be utilized in so many different ways as a forage, and it has a really high nutritional value, especially when containing the mid-brown midrib trait. This allows for animals to perform well on it. It's very palatable to animals, and like I said, it can be utilized in so many ways, which we'll be getting into. And so to start off with, I've always get a lot of questions about the variation in sorghum that we see. What's the difference between milo, forage sorghum, Sudan grass, sorghum Sudan grass, et cetera. And so I'm going to start talking off with these top 6 categories because these are generally the ones we're talking about if we're looking at forage species. And so there's other important forage or sorghums out there, such as sweet sorghum. Sweet sorghum is generally actually produced for its sugar content in the stem, and they use that to make molasses and syrup. And there's other sorghum species throughout the world that are used for grain production for human consumption, but we're really just going to focus on the top 6 because these are the ones that we see here mostly in the US and can be used in forage systems. And so to start off with, what is milo? So milo is actually green sorghum. It's species of sorghum bicolor. And generally speaking, it has a lot higher grain yields than the other sorghum families that we use as forages. As you can see here, the grain head is very well filled out. There's a lot of seed being produced there. And these plants are generally a lot shorter in comparison to our forage sorghums or sorghum Sudan grass. They're less than 5 feet tall because we have bred for them to be brachytic dwarfs. And they're stacked on these traits have been stacked so that they remain short so that we're not running into a lot of lodging issues in the field, because we can only imagine if this plant was 12 feet tall with a high amount of grain on top, lodging could become a huge problem. And these are very drought tolerant. And so the further west we go, when corn grain may not be as easily produced, we start seeing some more milo in those drought areas, especially when maybe you don't have a central pivot out in Nebraska or Kansas. And then we have fodder graze. We can also graze the fodder of milo. So you can harvest it and graze the fodder in a forage setting. And so next we have our forage sorghum. And as I mentioned, forage sorghum has a lot of variation. Forage sorghum is actually sorghum bicolor as well, but this has been cultivated to grow to have extremely tall, to be able to produce a large amount of biomass. This is frequently used as a forage. I've heard of it being used as a grain, but that's very uncommon. It could be quite difficult to harvest that grain, especially when you're looking at stuff that's over 12 feet tall. Generally, this is used as best as a one-cut use. It will regrow, but it just doesn't thrive as well as, say, a sorghum Sudan grass or Sudan grass in a multi-cut system. And so generally speaking, you're probably going to be looking at this for a silage or a green chop. And like I said, it produces a large amount of biomass. We're talking approximately 15 to 30 tons and 15 to 30 tons an acre. It has these large sweet stems that help increase that nutritional value. And sometimes you do use sweet sorghum, and this can fall under this category as well. Next, we have Sudan grass. Sudan grass is a cross between sorghum and a crop called Drummondii. This is mainly used as a forage through the US. I personally have never heard of anybody using it as a grain, but I believe in other countries you can grow it for the grain. It is a multi-cut, can be used in multi-cut systems. It regrows very well. And generally speaking, it's pretty fine stemmed. So you're able to have a large amount of leaf material compared to your stem ratio, helping with quality. But something to note is it does generally produce less biomass compared to, say, sorghum Sudan grass or forage sorghum. As you can see here, this is central plot is our Sudan grass, which is Green Street Rocket, and it's flanked by 2 sorghum Sudan grasses. And you can see that the sorghum Sudan grasses are considerably taller than our Sudan grass, because our Sudan grass generally only reaches about 4 to 6 feet tall, while our sorghum Sudan grasses can grow considerably taller, around 8 feet. Although something to mention about Sudan grasses is it produces less prussic acid compared to forage sorghum and sorghum Sudan grass. And we're going to get a little bit more into what prussic acid is and why that is a concern. But one of the benefits of Sudan grass is it does produce less prussic acid in general. And then we're going to talk about sorghum Sudan grass, which is just a cross between forage sorghum and Sudan grass. This is mainly used as a forage throughout the US. I've never heard of anybody using it as a grain producer unless you're in a breeding program. It has a really good multi-cut system like Sudan grass. And so I like this photo here because we were using it in a rotational grazing system. And I think this shows that regrowth very well. because so it was grazed in these first 3 plots first, and then we moved them to the second plot, and then they had just started getting into this 3rd plot here. The 4th one over, they haven't started grazing yet, so you can see that plot's really filled really well. But if you look back at that first plot, that regrowth is already taking over. It's the canopy is completely closed on those plots, and you can really see some really good regrowth occurring. And so it shows how well sorghum seeding and grass can work in some of these operations as a multi-cut system. Stand heights can vary, but generally they're around 8 feet tall. And lastly, there's a large amount of variation in sorghum seeding and grasses. And what I mean by that is I've seen sorghum seeding and grasses that are 12 feet tall. I've seen sorghum seeding that's 5 feet. I've seen them high to leaf to stem ratio versus it's very stemmy. So there's a lot of different aspects to think about when you're looking at these. Sorghum itself has a lot of variation, and even within sorghum seeding and grass, you can see a lot of variation in plant cultivars. And lastly, I wanted to talk about some of the weed species that we see with sorghum. So shattercane is sorghum bicolor. It is a subspecies it's different than our forage sorghum based on its subspecies, but shattercane is a noxious annual, or not a noxious annual weed, it is an annual weed, and it can cause problems in production. It looks very similar to our commercial sorghum varieties out there. And one thing that's important to know, because Johnson grass is a noxious weed, and you really do want to make sure you can get Johnson grass out of your field as soon as possible if you identify it. One way to identify it, shattercane and Johnson grass, is the seed heads or the inflorescence. Generally speaking, shattercane has a more dense head with a little bit larger seeds, while Johnson grass has less seeds, a more open panicle appearance. Both are, I would suggest if you see either of these in your field, I would try to remove them as quickly as possible. Johnson grass, though, is a perennial noxious weed, and this can be very problematic because it also spreads through rhizomes and can become firmly established in your field if it is not taken care of. And there's one more weed that I'm just going to mention real quick. It's called Sorghum alum. It is a cross between Johnson grass and sorghum bicolor. It does have rhizomes, but it's just not as persistent as Johnson grass. And both of these weeds can be found throughout Indiana, and I know the spread of shattercane is basically all the way to the West Coast, and Johnson grass is definitely present in the southern states and in the Midwest. And so now that we've talked a little bit about sorghum variation and different types of sorghum that we're using, we're going to look at how these can be utilized as a forage. And so we're going to be looking at ways to use this in a forage setting and how it can be beneficial. And so to start off with, we're going to talk about silage. Sorghum is a really good option of silage. It has a large amount of biomass production. And like I said, your forage sorghums can be reaching 15 to 30 tons with potentially pretty high quality, especially when containing that brown midrib trait I mentioned previously. The regrowth, I've heard of farmers using that regrowth that can be utilized for cover crop grazing. So if you cut this in late summer and you can have that regrowth occurring as you're going into that winter, either having it as a cover, or if it's grown enough before that first frost occurs, you could even potentially graze it. You generally harvest this in the soft dough stage, and your goals are 60 to 72% moisture, but unfortunately sorghum, like I said, it's really water use efficient, and so it holds on to that water really well. So getting that dry down can be kind of difficult, and so I've definitely heard of farmers producing silage out of it at a little higher moisture content, and it seems to work for them. But if you're really trying to reach that 60%, it's going to be quite difficult, especially here in the state of Indiana. You're probably going to have to windrow it and then chop it after that, just because those stems really are able to hold on to a lot of water. And generally speaking, when we're looking at this, I've normally have seen forage sorghum and sorghum Sudan grass used as silage production. One thing I would like to mention here is baleage. Baleage could be a good option, especially as more equipment has become available to make baleage. It gives you an option between making hay and silage, where, as I said, it can hold on to that moisture. So even if you windrow it, you might not ever get to a hay moisture content that you're looking for, especially, like I said, in the state of Indiana. So baleage is becoming a good option if you hit that 40 to 50% after you windrow it. And so next I'm going to talk about green chop. This is generally used before heading, so you can actually get multiple cuts out of this. You do want to wait till after 18 to 24 inches tall. This is when I'm talking about prussic acid. Prussic acid accumulates in the younger plants. Generally speaking, I don't think you would want to chop it that short anyways. You would want to get as much biomass production you can. You could be using this, you could cut multiple times, especially because you're cutting before heading and allowing that regrowth to occur. Something I would like to note here is if you're using it as green chop, you should definitely be feeding it that day. If you don't, there's a chance of nitrite accumulation, and nitrites are actually extremely dangerous to animals, more dangerous than nitrates. So you really want to make sure that you're utilizing your green chop as quickly as possible, not letting it sit overnight before you're feeding it to your animals, or else you could have nitrite poisoning occur. With this, I've heard of forage sorghum, sorghum Sudan grasses, and Sudan grasses all be used in this type of system, especially when you're thinking about multi-cut systems. The sorghum Sudan grasses and Sudan grasses work really well to get multiple cuts out of. So while forage sorghum really can give you that high biomass production. Next, we're going to look into hay production. This allows for, sorghum allows for multiple cuts throughout the year. Again, this should not be utilized until the plants are 18 to 24 inches tall. Using the smaller plants could be dangerous with that prussic acid condition. And also, if you are trying to, say, get a third cut and it's coming fall and you have a frost, you really do need to wait again until a week after the frost. I don't really see too many people in Indiana using it for hay production at that point, but I was just at the AFTC conference this past weekend, and I've heard of people in the southern states that will cut it for hay after frost has occurred. So if anybody's joining us from there, I just want to reiterate, wait that 1 week, make sure that prussic acid content has gone down again. I would suggest that you're using fine stemmed varieties for this because of drying. Like I said, sorghum is very water use efficient and really is good at holding on to a lot of water. And so we really want to be able to make sure that you have the opportunity for the sorghum to dry down to safe levels for hay making. And if you are having issues with that and you have baleage equipment, you could always use it as baleage instead. Generally speaking, what we use in these systems are those sorghum Sudan grasses and Sudan grasses. Our forage sorghums generally have like those really thick stems that make it very difficult to dry down to safe hay production levels. And lastly, we have pasture. Sorghum is a good option as a pasture. Like I mentioned in the sorghum Sudan grass slide, that multi-cut growth habit allows for rotational grazing, and you can keep these animals on the sorghum Sudan grass from basically when it reaches a safe height over 18 to 24 inches tall, all the way to the point where you're having that first frost occur, when you may need to be removing those animals after that frost. And they can always go back after the sorghum has been killed, and wait a week after that, or after that first frost occurs, wait a week if there's no concurrent frost occurring. And so this gives you a really good option in that summertime when you have a lot of cool season. You might have a lot of cool season pastures and you have a couple acres towards sorghum, where that summer slump hits, those cool season grasses slow down a bit. You can have sorghum available for your animals to feed on, because during those high heat summer months, this is a really good option because sorghum loves the high heat. I think headless varieties are good options for this because of their continued growth. If you have a lot of heading occurring, sometimes that regrowth can be slowed down because of the plants already trying to go into their reproductive cycles. What is generally used as pasture is sorghum, Sudan grass, and milo fodder over the wintertime for milo. And so as you're trying to think about using this, here are some like just generalities for planting and some growth characteristics for sorghum. So generally, you don't really want to plant sorghum until the soils are over 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Sorghum thrives in high temperatures, but it doesn't really like the cold so much. And when I say high temperatures, sorghum will continue growing all the way up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, where you say another summer annual corn, its growth starts to slow down when it gets above 85 degrees. Sorghum really takes in that heat, especially if there's moisture available. It can grow like a weed. Planting rates definitely vary depending on what you're using it for. So if you're using milo, generally speaking, you're planting it in 30-inch rows. It's about 8 to 10 pounds per acre. Forage sorghum, you can plant it in rows or drill it, and it's about 8 to 15 pounds per acre. And then Sudan grass and sorghum Sudan grass, their planting per acre runs anywhere from 15 to 30 to 20 to 40 pounds per acre. This depends on if you're drilling it, broadcasting it, etc. But always look at your spec sheets. They will have information on what your pounds per acre should be in those areas. Next, sorghum needs less fertilizer and water in comparison to corn. As I mentioned, it really thrives in it can thrive in drought environments, and it also needs less nitrogen fertilization. And in years like this year, when fertilizer prices are out the roof, it could definitely be a plant that's a crop that's a really good option on some acreage that you generally plant towards corn silage or something. And so as I'm getting talking about this, like I said, I'm not trying to persuade you to plant all your acreage into sorghum, but I think it is good as a niche crop. It's a good insurance crop. This could be used on some of your acreage in case you have a drought, or as it's becoming more common, tar spot is in your fields and it hurts your corn silage. It's a very versatile crop. You can plant it planting for, say, you're going to use it as a pasture, but then you change your mind and use it for hay, or you can definitely use it in multiple different ways. Something that I've heard of a lot of people using it as a grass-fed organic option, because it's a non-transgenic plant. Of course, if you're using it as an organic, you do still have to worry about some of the herbicides you're spraying and stuff like that, but it is a non-GMO, non-transgenic plant. I think it could fit into a system following winter wheat. You could use it as a pasture, hay crop, or green chop in this situation. If you're following winter wheat, you just don't have enough time to produce silage at that point. And then this year, especially, as I talked about fertilizer prices, we're also running into an issue with cool season grass seeds. There's definitely a chance that there will be a shortage of supply this year due to high droughts out west. And so summer annuals could be a really good option to use instead of having to potentially be renovating a pasture, et cetera. And lastly, with this, sorghum is naturally tolerant to corn rootworm. And a lot of our initial genetics that supplied corn with resistance to corn rootworm are actually becoming susceptible now. And so if you are running into that issue in your cornfields, using a rotation of sorghum in those fields will actually break that life cycle of corn rootworm. And so it could be a good option for some pest control. And I would like to talk a little bit more about this tar spot problem, because it's becoming actually a really big problem, especially in the state of Indiana and the northern half, really extremely a lot. It's been seen on many farms, including my own family farm. What tar spot does is it can really decrease corn silage quality. It decreases your grain yields. It causes early dry down. And basically what that does for your corn silage is you have really extremely low levels of moisture when you're trying to ensile it. And this leads to improper fermentation. And basically what happens is your pH does not drop fast enough, which increases your chance of mold. And also, if you don't have enough moisture in your silage, you have packing problems too. that could increase your chances of oxygen getting through your silage, increasing your chance of mold all over together. So if you've had tar spot in your field previous year, sorghum could be a really good option because tar spot does not affect sorghum. It could be, like I said, it'd be a really good insurance crop because you won't have to be worrying about spraying for tar spot as you would if you had a corn silage crop. And so these are all the benefits that I was talking about sorghum, but there are still some concerns when we're talking about sorghum production. And the two major concerns are prussic acid and nitrate poisoning. So prussic acid is specific to sorghum species, and how this occurs is we have an accumulation of what's called durin, which durin is our precursor to hydrogen cyanide release. And so durin will be regulated probably high amount in your leaves and at different time frames. And what happens is when animals come and they chew on the leaves, they cause the cell walls and the cell membranes to break down, introducing durin to interact with durinase, which is the enzymes that facilitate the breakdown of durin to the secondary compound that either can spontaneously break down into hydrogen cyanide and p-hydroxybenzaldehyde, or it can also be even stimulated through alpha hydroxy nitrile lysase. But the important part of this is I just want to iterate that durin is the precursor to hydrogen cyanide / prussic acid release, because we'll talk about durin a little bit more later. And next is our nitrate poisoning. Nitrate poisoning can occur in other crops outside of sorghum. And this can occur in many cereal grains, corn, pearl millet, wheat, and even other crops such as sweet clover. And so I'm gonna start talking about how both of these accumulate and some management practices that can be taken to make sure that we are avoiding these potential problems. And so accumulation of durin content can occur in young plants. So that's why I was always saying you have that recommendation that you don't graze your animals or cut it for hay at less than 18 to 24 inches tall. That will help dilute the durin content with the taller and growing plants. Something always to consider is your tillers can accumulate in high levels of durin. So make sure your tillers as well are reaching that 18 to 24 inches tall. And then a frost can cause durin accumulation as well. And that's why there's that 1 week rolling recommendation that every time you have a frost, you have to wait a week before you're able to graze your animals again. This is until the plants are completely killed off. And then you wait a week and you can feed your animals that sorghum crop. But always be ready if you think it's killed off to check for those new growth tillers, because animals can selectively graze that newer vegetative tissue. And if those tillers are high in prussic acid, it could be very dangerous. And then next we have extreme drought. Extreme drought can cause prussic acid or durin accumulation in your plants. Generally speaking, this becomes more of a problem when we're talking about southern and western states, where our northern latitudes we're generally more worried about that frost occurring. And then lastly, over-fertilization of nitrogen. This can cause that durin accumulation as well. And so ways to manage for hydrogen cyanide is you really just want to avoid grazing small plants. All the recommendations generally say 18 to 24 inches tall. In my opinion, it's just to be safe, wait till it's 24 inches tall. If it's during the summer, we have that high heat and enough moisture content, 18 to 24 inches tall is probably a matter of 2 days in growth. And then avoid those drought stressed and frost stressed plants, really just trying to avoid grazing those stressed plants that could be causing durin accumulation. So there have been ways to utilize sorghum to reduce hydrogen cyanide potential or durin content, and those two are silage and grain chop. For silage, the chopping and the fermentation causes durin to be broken down and release hydrogen cyanide during that time. It's been estimated up to 70% 70% decrease in HCN potential in silage. Green chop helps because the chopping helps break down some of the cells, but also you are mixing the leaves and stems where the animals cannot selectively graze the leaves, which are generally higher in durum content. And so you're trying to dilute it out a bit in the green shop. Something I want to mention here is we always used to think hay production was a safe way to feed your animals sorghum Sudan grass or sorghum. Some research here at Purdue, which I'll mention later, has kind of shown that actually during the drying process, durum is quite stable at that time. And then lastly, use varieties known to be low in durum accumulation. There have been cultivated species out there that have really been selected for low durum accumulation, just so that you don't have to worry about it so much. So nitrate accumulation generally occurs when you are having a drought system with over-fertilization of nitrogen. The combination of those two make nitrates accumulate in high amounts. And generally speaking, unlike prussic acid, where that main concern's in the leaves, nitrate accumulation occurs a lot in the stems. And so a way to manage nitrates is you should avoid grazing droughty sorghum plants. And you should also avoid grazing these plants for several days after rainfall. That the rain can cause a lot of growth habits to occur, and those can be very dangerous at that time. And if you are concerned about it, don't send hungry livestock to the pasture. Hungry livestock have a thing about grazing everything, including the stems, and so you are really putting them more in danger of accumulating in nitrate toxicity and potentially harming them. Next, ensiling actually is a way to help decrease nitrate content by 20 to 50%. Something that you need to note though is even though it could decrease nitrates by 50%, depending on the concentration of nitrates in those stems, you could still be at dangerous levels for feeding. Other things that can help is raise your cutter bar above 6 inches. As I said, nitrates accumulate in the stem, but they really accumulate at the base of the stem. So if you're raising above those 6 inches, you are eliminating the highest concentration of nitrates in the plant. And then don't oversupply nitrogen. Try to make sure you get your field tested, making sure that you're not just applying X amount of nitrogen because that's what we do. And then lastly, test. If you are concerned about nitrate accumulation, send your samples in to get tested. And so if you have an animal that you are like, I wonder what's going on, it's acting funny, and it's either could be going through convulsions, labored breathing, gasping, paralysis, and in both cases, death can occur very quickly. These symptoms are very similar to both prussic acid and nitrate, and they can be easily mistaken for each other, especially if we're not going in to look a little bit closer. Because prussic acid, it causes a bright cherry red blood, while nitrates cause chocolate brown blood. Both of these, why the symptoms are so similar, is both of these cause the animal cannot utilize oxygen at these points. So basically they're both suffocating. And like I said, this can occur very quickly within 10 to 15 minutes. Animals can be dying. And so if you see any of these symptoms, or you have some animals that you suspect for either of these, definitely remove the rest of the animals from from that feed source and I would probably check to see which one you're having problems with, either through testing of the plant material or checking the animal for the difference between bright cherry red blood and the chocolate brown blood. And so now I want to talk about some of the traits that I think are really important to consider if you're going to be using sorghum. And these are going to be current traits that are on the market now and future traits that are going to become available. And so these are going to cover sugarcane aphid tolerance, brown midrib trait, photoperiod sensitivity, dry stalk, leaf to stem ratio, broochitic dwarfs, herbicide resistance, and then our near future that should be on the market soon is a durum-free hybrid or prussic acid-free sorghum that I've been working with here at Purdue. And so I'm really going to go into depth for the first three. So I'm going to quickly just kind of tell you what dry stalk is. Dry stalk is the ability for the plant to dry down easier, especially when you're trying to reach those lower moisture contents for silage production. Leaf to stem ratio, this is important in the sense that generally leaves have higher nutritional value, and being able to balance that leaf to stem ratio in the plant, especially when you're looking at pasture settings, especially because if they're going to be grazing most of the leaves, you want a higher leaf content. And also as a hay, our stems generally cause us problems with the dry down. So having a higher leaf to stem ratio can be very beneficial. Graphitic dwarfs are basically helping shorten the plant. This helps in many ways. One way I think it helps too is when you're pasture grazing your animals, we don't really want it to be a jungle. Animals don't like walking into things that are over their heads. And so, especially when it's a solid wall that's over your head. And so being able to shorten the plant, animals being able to walk in, see over top of it, I think it makes them more comfortable. And then herbicide resistance. So we have herbicide resistance in sorghum for there's two traits that convert this, and they're both group 2 herbicides that can be sprayed on this. What's interesting about these, in my opinion, is they're both non-transgenic. So you're not going to have to worry about that GMO label on these plants. And so to get into a little bit more detail about sugarcane aphid tolerance, the reason I want to talk about this is sugarcane aphid has been very problematic in the southern U.S., and we've seen it in the southern Indiana for I think the past 3 years. One way to identify them is they have black tip feet, antennae, and cornicles. And so as you can see here in this photo, you can obviously see those black feet tips. You have those black antennae, and the cornicles are the little extensions off the back end of the aphid. And so these two photos are actually from the Southern Indiana Purdue Ag Center. And so we were able to identify sugarcane aphid in two of their sorghum fields. And why this is so problematic, it can cause extreme damage. Sugarcane aphid explodes very quickly in your field. So even though they're very small, their populations grow exponentially. It can kill the leaves. It can cause lodging issues due to the fact sugarcane aphid feeding helps introduce some stalk rots and cause those lodging problems. And it produces a high amount of honeydew. And that honeydew is a very sticky material that can plug your machinery up and cause a lot of problems there. And so if you have seen this, I would definitely suggest using a tolerant hybrids. Tolerant hybrids are available currently, and I would suggest using those to hopefully reduce your problems with sugarcane aphid, especially if you've seen it previously. Next, I'd like to talk about the brown midrib trait. This trait, or kind of commonly considered the BMR, what it does is it decreases the lignin content in your plants and in those stems. What lignin is a fiber in the stalks, and that basically is really hard for animals to digest. So the higher the lignin content, the less likely that plant is going to be easily digest. So brown midrib trait helps with increasing higher digestibility. And we have seen that this plant also increases palatability for animals. It tastes better to them. And one way to easily identify it is just by its name. If you look at that midrib, it's a brown color. Where generally, if we're looking at a conventional hybrid that does not contain this, we're looking at a very white midrib in comparison. When you see two plants next to each other, one with and one without, it's very obvious. And lastly, I want to talk about photoperiod sensitivity. And this is where we get our heading varieties and our headless varieties. So photoperiod sensitivity, basically, a photoperiod sensitive sorghum plant, it relies on day length and night length to flower or to head out. And so in the northern latitudes, we're not going to see a variety heading until probably late October or late September, October. And so if we're just continuing that vegetative growth, it just continues to put on more biomass and more biomass. But one problem with this, it can be difficult to dry down. So if you're using it for silage, I would not suggest that. The last time I saw a headless variety used for silage, it basically took a killing frost and a dry down after that for them to be able to chop it at acceptable moisture levels. But I think it has a really good place in those multi-cut systems because without that head, you're able to put on more biomass and that regrowth is very strong. Photoperiod insensitive, these are plants that are based on growing degree units. And so, which corn in Indiana is based on growing degree units as well. And so these will put on a head late summer, are very good options, like I said, for silages, because you're going to able to have that time for that dry down after that head starts to appear. And so now I'm going to talk about some of our future opportunities that happened, and this is the work that I was doing here at Purdue. And so just to start off with, I'm going to just quickly describe the biosynthetic pathway of Durin. And so Durin's created from the amino acid tyrosine, and it goes through 3 enzymes to create Durin. And as I mentioned previously, Durin is the precursor to HCN release. And so here we decided, how can we make a prussic acid-free sorghum? And what we did is we tried to make it Durin-free. And we did this by mutagenizing the gene for the first enzyme in the biosynthetic pathway. And so now this CYP79A1 gene or enzyme is non-functional. So without this enzyme, it stops this whole pathway and no Durin is created. And so without Durin, we don't have our prussic acid release. And this trait over a 10-year period was incorporated into sorghum forage lines. And what my job was is to test kind of different aspects of this. But one of the first things we wanted to do is, yes, theoretically, Durin should not, without Durin, hydrogen cyanide should not be produced. So we wanted to make sure that that's actually what was happening. And so using a Fiegel-Anger test, which is a test for hydrogen cyanide, we were looking to see if our Durin-free line produced HCN. And so we tested 4 hybrids, 3 conventional that do produce Durin and 1 that does not. And what you see here is the Fiegel-Anger test. And if you see blue shading, that means hydrogen cyanide is being released. And so these are individual plant samples representing, and everything circled in red is our Durin-free hybrid. And at each time point, there was no HCN release from this hybrid. So we were able to determine that Durin content was not there, and we're still not seeing that hydrogen cyanide release. So that was a really important aspect before we moved on in our breeding process. And so while I've been here, I've tested Durin accumulation in multiple different ways to really understand how this Durin-free sorghum could be impacting forage production. And so one of the first things I wanted to see is, okay, maybe if we put it under stress like frost, maybe somehow it can revert back to its natural habits. But what we found is Durin accumulation was not influenced by a frost in our Durin-free hybrid. So we had no hydrogen cyanide release after a frost occurred. And even this last summer, this fall actually, we were able to graze our Durin-free sorghum on frosted sorghum plants without any problems, while our conventional hybrids increased in Durin content following a frost. Next, like I mentioned, we never saw or detected HCN release from the Durin-free hybrid or detected any Durin. And so why this is important is we were looking at actually what happens when you dry down sorghum. And what we found, as I mentioned previously, drying sorghum did not decrease Durin content. So generally, we always thought during the drying process and making hay, hydrogen cyanide potential will decrease or Durin content. And this is not what we saw in our conventional hybrids. Conventional hybrids meaning the hybrids that do produce Durin. And we wanted to understand maybe it was a hydrogen cyanide release problem, but when we introduced those dry products to rumen fluid, it caused a great release of HCN very quickly. And so so far it's showing, okay, our Durin-free hybrid is very safe after frost. We never see Durin, we never see hydrogen cyanide release. But at the same time, if animals don't eat it, it's not going to be very, it's not going to work, because if animals don't eat it, they're not going to get any value from it. And so we wanted to compare feeding preference to marketed hybrids. So we had 3 conventional hybrids, Sweet 6, Sweet Bites, and Green Street Rocket, compared to our Durin-free hybrid. And so we tested this in multiple ways. And what we found was our Durin-free hybrid was more palatable. And I would just want to show you visually of what we were seeing in the field. And so what we had seen is using UAV images, we thresholded it for a factor called NDVI. And so what you're going to see is everything in black is basically background, while everything in white is the green material left. So on day 0, before animals were allowed to graze, which we were grazing ewes, you can see that everything started off pretty consistent. And as time goes on, I want you to follow the red boxes, which is our Durin-free. Within 24 hours, you see a great decrease in green material in our Durin-free hybrids. And so at this point, we're seeing a lot of that leaf tissue dissipate in those plots because of ewes grazing. And then by day 2, there's almost no green plant material left in those because of such highly grazing pressure from the ewes. And what we saw visually here is just mostly a lot of stems were left, very, very little leaf material. And so we showed a really great palatability for our Durin-free hybrid. And so lastly, we wanted to check to make sure they actually perform well on our Durin-free hybrid. And so we compared 2 hybrids. One was an S&W SP4105, which is a sorghum Sudan grass brown midrib headless, with that compared to our Durin-free hybrid, which is a sorghum Sudan grass brown midrib Durin-free trait. And so one difference that we do have here is, as you can see here on the left, our Durin-free is producing heads, while over here on the right, this is our S&W hybrid that does not produce heads. But what we found is over a 62-day period, we showed that they actually gained, on an average daily gain, very similar, about 2 pounds per day. And even at 34 days, we were seeing very similar weights at 1.62 for the Durin producer, which is the S&W, and our Durin-free, which is 1.7 pounds per day, average daily gain. So overall, we're really seeing some good benefits of this Durin-free hybrid that should be on the market soon. And so some final thoughts about using opportunities with sorghum genetics is, what are your goals? Did you have a tar spot issue last year? What can fill that spot? Where does sorghum fit in your plans? Do you need more forage for pasture during the summer? Do you need maybe silage for winter time or hay? Then what traits do you want? What traits should you be considering? Have you had sugarcane aphid problems previously? And just really thinking about that. And you should always read your spec sheets or talk with your seed dealer to really make sure that the hybrid fits your needs that you're looking for. And so with that, are there any questions?
All right, thank you very much, Shelby. So we don't have any questions in the chat box at the moment, but I had a couple for you. I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll real quick while we're having question time. Time to complete it.
Sure.
So the first question I had for you, is there a test out there for the prussic acid to ensure it's out of our stem before we're baling it or ensiling it or anything like that? I know there is for the nitrate, but is there one for prussic?
Unfortunately, there's not that you can usually use as a farmer. You can send it into certain laboratories. All the laboratories that I've ever seen that actually test for it are more west in the state. If you are going to send it into a laboratory, definitely talk to them about sampling procedures. Sampling could affect the amount of prussic acid that they're going to be able to detect depending on how you're handling those samples. So definitely make sure you talk to them about sampling and making sure you're getting it to them as quickly as possible.
All right, thank you. Next question we have in the chat. When can we see the Durin-free on the market?
So with that, it is currently going to be marketed through S&W hybrids, and I believe it's within the next potentially 3 years, 2 to 3 years, or yeah.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. Our next question, would you consider adding cowpeas to a Sudex stand?
it could be like kind of like one of those nitrogen, it helps with the nitrogen availability. I would be concerned, depending on how well your Studex stands are, that there could be a lot of canopy cover and you would have a hard time to establish your cowpeas. I'm not a 100% expert on that, but I would be concerned about getting your cowpeas established in that system, just because sorghum, it can have a really thick canopy and you could have a really hard time with light penetration down to your cowpeas, especially as the plant gets taller.
So we had another question here. I'm sure this is kind of referencing to the Durham free, but what, or maybe any of the species or varieties, what do you feel would work best when grazing any of our sorghum species using sheep? What varieties?
I would say grazing sheep, I would consider your sorghum Sudan grasses or potentially Sudan grasses. Like I said, those forage sorghums can really grow really tall, and I don't really want them walking around through bamboo because there's just a high chance of one, trampling, and two, they don't want to enter it because it's kind of intimidating. So looking for some varieties that are just naturally a little bit shorter, looking for those dwarf varieties that can keep a little bit of shorter height. If you're grazing, I'd probably look for those headless varieties that continue on putting that leaf material instead of putting on the grain.
Okay, thank you. All right, so how do the sorghum species perform on wet, heavy clay soils? I know you said they prefer kind of drier situations, but how would they prefer on the other end?
That is a good question. I actually haven't grown it too much in wet, heavy clay soils. I'm sorry, I'd have to do some research on that and I could get back to you for that information. I could see them doing fairly well unless it's like a lot of standing water. Standing water could be problematic, especially for seedling development. We did have, so this summer on our performance trial, we did have a lot of wet ground over in the Scholler farm. And we actually had pretty good stands even in that wet area. But I would be concerned if you have a lot of standing water on the ground that seedling development could be very difficult.
Mm-hmm. That's what I know. My parents, most of their property has some good clay mixed throughout it. And they've done some sorghum and sorghum Sudan crosses as kind of the summer relief type areas. And it's grown well for them. They haven't seen a lot of issues in their personal experience. So.
Oh, that's good to hear.
Yeah. So, all right. So the next question I had for you, Shelby, is looking at that frost time frame of waiting a week after that frost before you're grazing it again. So do we have to restart that time frame if during that week we get another frost, or is it from the first frost a week out?
So every time you have a new frost occur, you have to wait that week. So it's just that rolling recommendation. So unfortunately, when we start getting into late October, we're just going to have continuous frost occurring. But once that plant is completely dead and you wait that week after that frost, generally that plant is safe because it's not reproducing any Durham accumulation because the plant's dead. And those frosts have caused the cell membrane to break, and it causes that release of HCN after the plant has completely died off. I'd still wait the week after the plant's completely died off, give it that time. But yeah, it's a rolling suggest until then. I think my biggest remark on that is just try to utilize it before that frost comes. Just to make sure you're safe. If you utilize it before it comes, you don't even have to worry about it. When the Durham free hybrid is on the market, you don't have to worry about a frost anymore. But until then, I'd say just utilize it before you have that worry.
Okay, thank you. And then the next question that I had is looking at those hybrids that you had tested, especially with the ewes in the grazing program. Were the 3 hybrids that you tested the Durham free against ones that were proven on the market to be preferable in grazing situation?
So The hybrids that we had, generally speaking, our Sweet 6 did the second best in comparison. From the way it looked, our Green Treat Rocket had really good leaf material and actually looked like a very nice plant. Generally speaking, our Sweet 6 had was the second preference, really grazed, which that is a sorghum Sudan grass brown midrib.
Okay. All right, so another comment in here. So I think sorghums could have an advantage on wet soils. Having a later planting date than a cool season grass or corn gives much better odds of wet soils being dry enough to plant at the right time. So that's a great point, Dustin. Thank you. So
yes, I agree completely with that. Yes.
All right. Do we have any other questions for this afternoon for Dr. Gruss? Okay. So when you're in siling, would you bag corn and Sudex silage separately, or would you advise mixing them together?
I would probably bag them separately, just because you could have variation if you're bagging one side to the next side in potential moisture content and leakage over. And then you could just potentially, if you wanted to feed them together, I wouldn't have any issues with that. And also, if you potentially maybe have a nitrate problem in one of those, if you're mixing them together, you could end up causing both of them to have a nitrate problem. So I would personally bag them separately.
All right, thank you. So again, if you have any other questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box. Just to remind you all again, we do have 6 more Forage Forum Fridays planned through the end of February. So February 25th will be our last one. Next week, we will be back talking with some of our specialists from the Ohio State University, talking about kind of our fertilizer markets, utilizing fertilizers, things like that, since we know that is going to be a potential issue this coming year with prices and things like that. So that's going to be our topic next week. Also, for those of you that are here in Indiana, we have our upcoming Indiana Forage Council annual meeting on February 24th. So we invite you to that. We'll have more details here in the next couple of weeks on that information. So, all right. So any other questions for Dr. Gruss today? All right, I'm not seeing any coming in. So again, thank you so much, Shelby, for being with us today. We greatly appreciate this information that you've shared with us. So we do have one question here. Is there a difference in animal utilization based on row spacing of that planted forage? So the wider the row, is it easier for them to go down or things like that?
So generally speaking, when I see it used for like a pasture or hay, it's generally drilled. You have that tight row spacing that causes just basically easy canopy cover. And then that way you can close that canopy. You don't have to worry about so much weed pressure. When you're utilizing it as silage, I see it a lot in 30-inch rows. You're using varieties that are producing a lot more biomass that need that row spacing for that. Every time I've done it in a pasture trial, I've always drilled it at, I think, 7.5-inch rows. So I haven't had any issues with animals going into it, especially when they're not over their heads. I had one time where sorghum was taller than them. They did not want to enter. They were very nervous to enter, which I would be too if I didn't know what was going on. So.
All right, thank you. All right, we're not seeing any others. So again, thank you all for joining us today. We greatly appreciate you being here, and we look forward to our future topics. So have a wonderful Friday afternoon and a weekend. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having me.